right about now. The Funk Soul Brother, check it out now. The Funk Soul Brother, right about now. Right up now, check it out now. The Funk Soul Brother, right about now. Now.
Well, hey, everybody. Welcome to the Right About Now podcast. This is John Small. You know, I was really excited to have released one book this year. And then I had my guest on, and she's released 70 books in her career. 70 books. Many of them New York Times bestsellers. Of course, I am talking about J.A. Jance. And on this show, we're going to find out how this former high school teacher, who was told by her English teacher, by her ex-husband, by some publishers, that she didn't have what it took to be a writer. In fact, she shouldn't even think about being a writer. Yeah, well, she showed them. So how did she do it? Well, that, my friends, is a mystery that we will solve in this interview. So J.A. joins me to tell her really interesting story about how she got into the writing business. And in fact, I would have included her origin story in my book had I only known. Maybe she'll appear in the sequel. She talks to me about coming up in the extremely sexist publishing industry of the 70s. It was like the worst. And how her encounter with a serial killer led to her first book. We talk about the challenges and the joys of maintaining long-running character series. She's got 3 different characters that she alternates between, different series with different characters. Such an interesting approach to writing books. And we talk about her unorthodox writing process. She does it in her own way, which I found really interesting, the way that she writes mysteries. And, you know, we even get the pleasure of J.A. reciting one of her own poems, just spontaneously. And J.A.'s latest novel, Den of Iniquity, features the return of her beloved private investigator, J.P. Beaumont, and it tackles timely issues like opioid addiction and domestic violence. I had a great time talking to J.A. She is really a legend in the business. So without further ado, here is J.A. Jance. J.A. Jance, welcome to the Right About Now podcast.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here. I'm very happy to be here. It's been a long, hard climb, as Helen Reddy would say.
Yes, for those just joining us, J.A. or Judy, do you mind if people know that your name is Judy, by the way?
Actually, my name is Judith Ann, but
Judith.
My first publisher said nobody would read a police procedural written by somebody named Judy. And so I became J.A. Jance, and that's sort of the brand name. So I prefer to be called J.A.
So I'll call you J.A. We'll keep it on brand. Anyway, so J.A., we do most of our interviews on Riverside FM, but it turns out the Riverside FM is not always the easiest program to log on to. So you had spent the last hour or so with your grandson, trying to figure out how to download Google Chrome.
Grandson talking to me FaceTime from some place on I-5, trying to help me to find Google, get it to download, and put it into my applications. So
this could be the next topic of a mystery novel for you. How to get onto the crime scene is Riverside FM.
When things really upset me, they generally do end up in a bad way in my books. Started with my former husband, but there you are.
Please don't have your next murder victim a podcaster from Los Angeles. So I apologize in advance.
Don't worry about it.
Okay. Anyway, thrilled to have you on the show. You're really a legend in the mystery writing space, and it's just wonderful to talk to you. And you have such an incredible origin story. I just released a book on writers' origin stories and some of the writers I've talked to over the years and how they got started in writing. And I wish I had talked to you before I released the book, because your story would have been in the book. But anyway, for the sequel of that book, would you mind regaling us with the tale of how you first knew you wanted to be a writer? Because you can trace it back to the second grade in your case.
Yes, my second grade teacher's classroom had shelves full of books under the windows. And if you finished your work first, you could go to those books and bring one back to your desk to read. And it was there that I encountered not just The Wizard of Oz, but all of the Frank Baum books.
Wow.
And what struck me in second grade was that there was a human being who had put those words on the pages. And from second grade on, I wanted to be the person putting the words on the pages. I grew up, I won a scholarship to the University of Arizona because I wanted to be a writer. I signed up to be an English major. The summer of before my junior year, when it was time to sign up for those upper division courses, I was working part-time in the English department, and the creative writing professor came in and I said, "Oh, I'm hoping to sign up for your class this fall." And he looked me up and down and he said, "You're a girl." And I said, "So?" He said, "Girls become teachers or nurses, boys become writers." And he wouldn't let me in his class.
That's the worst thing I've ever heard. What year is this?
That was 1964, but I can actually top it. My boyfriend was allowed in the creative writing class that was closed to me, and I actually helped him with some of his papers. He got a good grade. Married him. He never published anything. But in 1968, when we got married, he told me, "There's only going to be one writer in our family, and I'm it." So I stifled. I didn't start writing until after I was divorced, 13 years later. But in my first hardback, you'll be interested to know, a book called Hour of the Hunter, the first of the Walker family books. Diana Ladd, main character, is a teacher on an Indian reservation who always wanted to be a writer. She's married to a man who was allowed in the creative writing program that was closed to her. He's dead at the beginning of the book. And the crazed killer in that book turns out to be a former professor of creative writing from the University of Arizona. Don't you just love it when that happens?
Poetic justice. Poetic justice. You often let incidents from your life inform your characters and your storylines, correct?
Actually, I do. And it is after I put them in, then I say, "Oh, that's where that came from." In high school, as a sophomore, I was invited to be in girls' trio. So for 1 hour a day, I was in a class with two other girls and three girls actually, because the pianist was also a girl, and our teacher. And partway through the year, he decided to teach us how to breathe. I mean, you don't breathe through your boobs. So girls in that class talked it over, and we all decided we were going to quit. I quit.
For those listening, he was doing a little touchy-feely on your chest to teach you how to breathe. He was giving you a little, very inappropriate lift of the boobs.
So I quit girls' trio and spent the last 2 years of high school in band. The other girls stayed in trio, presumably learning to breathe. But that incident shows up in Den of Iniquity, in the background to the story. And it wasn't until after I had written it in that I realized what I had done. And that's so much of writing for me is truly magic, because things go in subconsciously that I'm not aware of. I wrote 4 books about J.P. Beaumont, who had a terrible drinking problem.
Yep.
Before my readers started pointing out that he had a terrible drinking problem. And I said, these are books.
Yeah.
But enough of them pointed it out. And I realized that I had patterned him after my first husband, who died of chronic alcoholism at age 42. And my readers were right. They knew Beaumont was a problem drinker before I actually came to a conscious understanding of it. So that stuff happens in my books, and it always surprises me. It turns out in my Joanna Brady books, Joanna's mother, Eleanor Lathrop Winfield, is a dead ringer for my mother. It took my Aunt Alice to point that out to me.
I guess you sort of can't help it. If it's part of your experience, how is it not going to leak into it? But it's not a conscious decision, which is very interesting for you. It just kind of happens organically.
Yes, I don't sit down and say, I'm going to, but actually the exception to that is I did decide on the creative writing professor. I had written 9 Detective Beaumont books in a row, and I was sort of tired of him. The first book I ever wrote, a book that was never published, was a true crime, a slightly fictionalized true crime version of a time in 1970 when my first husband and I crossed paths with a serial killer. I wrote that book. He was a man who killed people at 20 minutes after 2 on the 22nd day of the month. He shot a 16-year-old girl off a bicycle, a 40-something-year-old man off a bulldozer, and a 28-year-old woman who was driving to Mexico with her 2 children in the backseat. He shot her in her vehicle. And half an hour after forcing her off the highway, shooting her, raping her, and leaving her to die, she gave my husband a ride home. And so when we found out what had happened, my husband was instrumental in helping identify the killer. And so we were part of that investigation. That's the only real investigation I've ever been a part of. But
how was he instrumental in? How did he know? How did he?
Well, he rode in the car. We were teaching on a reservation. He gave my husband a ride. My husband it was prom weekend. I was a junior class sponsor. I had to stay late to decorate for the prom. We had company coming to our house, which was 30 miles away, 2 miles off the highway. And someone had to be at the house to let them in. So at lunchtime, he said, well, I'll hitchhike home after school, and then you can bring the car home when you're done. So that's what we did. So he stuck out his finger, and this guy in a green car gave him a ride, not just to our turnoff, but he gave him a ride the extra 2 miles of dirt road to our house. And on the dirt road, he said to my husband, you leave your wife out here by herself much? And he said, she's got the dogs. Then that evening, when we were going into town, I overheard a deputy at the counter talking about a homicide on the reservation and somebody in a green car. And when I got back into the car, I mentioned that to my husband. He said, a guy in a green car. I wonder if that's the guy who gave me a ride home today.
Wow.
And it was.
That's wild.
He was able to describe the car. The detective came and interviewed us for 10 hours the next day. And he got him to remember the items that were in the car. He got him to remember there was a torn check from Union Bank, the same bank we used, a personal check that was lying on the seat. And he got him to remember first name of the woman on the signature. And so the detective was able to go to Union Bank, get a list of all the names with that first name, joint accounts with that name in it. My husband was able to identify the kind of car. It was a Ford Maverick. And when he did a composite,
yeah.
Composite turned into compost in my head. Some of the right letters.
I blame Google.
The 4-year-old boy looked at that and said, that's the man who killed my mommy. So the detective was able to identify him, and he pled guilty. He is still in prison in Arizona to this day. But the first book I ever wrote was a fictional treatment of that story. And I wrote it. It was the first thing I ever wrote. I wasn't in the creative writing program, so I didn't know there were some things I should leave out. I put everything in. The resulting manuscript was 1,400 pages long. I found an agent. She convinced me to remove half of it,
Yeah.
which she still couldn't sell it because it was still
A lot.
700 pages long.
Right.
And the readers that turned it down said that the stuff that was fiction was fine and the stuff that was real was unbelievable and would never happen. So that book just sat there. Well, I wrote 9 Detective Beaumont books. The first Beaumont manuscript sold to the second editor who saw it. And he bought it as the beginning of a series. And Den of Iniquity is J.P. Beaumont number 26.
What do you think it was about the second attempt, or at least with the J.P. Beaumont book, that stuck, that you didn't get right with the first one?
Well, it was all fiction. It was all fiction. I didn't have to deal with anything real. After I wrote 9 of them, I was bored with him and getting ready to knock him off. And my editor said, "Oh, don't do that. Do you remember that book you wrote? The one nobody ever bought? Why don't you rework that one and we'll make that your first hardback?" And I said, "Okay." So they sent me a check. They sent me a contract. I signed it. They sent me a check. I spent it. They gave me a deadline. But that guy was still in prison in Arizona. And I didn't want to write a book that would draw his attention to me. And so I had a contract and a deadline, but I didn't have a bad guy. So I had this terrible case of writer's block. And then my University of Arizona alumni magazine came, and I read the whole thing from cover to cover. That's indicative of my desperation. And right at the end, just before the obituaries, was this little boxed article that said the newly reconstituted creative writing program at the U of A was just going swimmingly. So I turned to my second husband, the nice one, and I said, I graduated from there. Maybe I've got all these books. Maybe they'd like me to come down and be writer in residence for a semester in the Sun. So call him up, ask him. Well, I sold life insurance for 10 years. I'm not afraid of a cold call. So I called him up, spoke to the director and told him who I was and what I did. And this is a direct quote. He said, "Oh, we don't do anything with genre fiction here. We only do literary fiction." It was a miracle. I was healed of writer's block on the spot. And the creative writing professor went straight into Hour of the Hunter.
Right About Now is brought to you by AG1. If you are a longtime listener, you might know that I've been drinking AG1 for about 2 years now. I mean, I even have little packets of this stuff that I take with me on trips. That's because AG1 is a foundational nutrition supplement that supports your body's universal needs. Things like gut optimization, stress management, and immune support. Not only did I replace my multivitamin, which was like a horse pill, with AG1, but I love that every scoop also includes prebiotics, probiotics, and digestive enzymes. Lord knows I could use more of those. If you want to so here's what you want to do. So you want to try AG1, this is what you got to do. You go to drinkag1.com/writeaboutnow. That's drinkag1.com/writeaboutnow and get a free 1-year supply of vitamin D3, K2, and 5 of the aforementioned free travel packs with your first purchase. Drink AG1. It's good to find foes, right? You can always make them your characters or the characters that end up getting murdered. So that's so interesting about the origin of J.P. Beaumont. And what you've done so brilliantly is that you've been able to serialize all these different books with, these characters. You have J.P. Beaumont, you have the Walker family, you have Joanna Brady, Allie Reynolds. And was that your idea initially, to take characters and then serialize books based on their adventures? Or because that's a brilliant way to keep, yourself interested, but also keep a career going, right?
I thought when I wrote Until Proven Guilty, I thought I was writing a one and done book, but they bought it as a series. And then they bought two more. And then they bought two more. And I didn't want to write a character that I wanted to see a character change. So I decided that Beau and I would age together. And so I actually gave him my birthday, October 27th, 1940. We're both getting up there. But when I started writing Joanna, I had two sets of readers. I had the readers that would read Joanna books, and I had the readers that would read Beaumont books. And my editor said, we need to get both sets of readers reading the same book. And so that's when I wrote Partner in Crime and brought both characters together. And that was a real challenge because, number one, I had to line up their timelines, which is really challenging.
Tricky.
And Beau's books are written in the first person. That's how I met him, in the first person. I had tried writing that first book for months and it wasn't going anywhere. I sent myself to Portland on the train. My kids were at spring break. I got on a train to go to Portland, and I had a stack of blue line notebooks and a fistful of pens. And I thought, what would happen if I wrote this book through the detective's point of view? So I got out a notebook, I got out a pen, and I wrote, she might have been a cute kid once. That was hard to tell now. She was, whoa. And there I was at the crime scene, walking around it in J.B. Beaumont's shoes, seeing it through his eyes, hearing what was said through his ears, hearing what he said to others, but also hearing what was going on inside his head. And he and I have been authoring, that was in March of 1983. And he and I have been author and character ever since. And he only speaks to me, first person. So Joanna Brady books are in third person. Beau was in first. So their chapters had to be in the way readers were accepting. And that my editor was very wise, because I did get people to stop being Beaumont or Joanna Brady fans and get them to come together.
What's the difference for you in writing in the first? Like, why do you make a decision to write in the third person? Is it because you get to tell me a little bit about that?
After writing 9 books in the first person, that requires a real mindset, because the reader only knows what the main character sees, hears, does, says. And so when I wrote The Hunter, that has 7 or 8 different points of view. It has an elastic timeline that stretches back and forth over 70 years. And writing that was like going on vacation.
Yeah.
When my editor suggested I write something so I could alternate, that New York wasn't really fond of those Walker books. So, I mean, Indians, what do Indians mean to New York, right? So the Indian stuff was sort of the point. She wasn't my editor for very long, I will add. But so my first editor suggested I come up with a different character. And I thought, okay, how about if I press the easy button and instead of using first person, I use third? I started writing about a middle-aged male protagonist who was a cop. I wasn't male. I was middle-aged. I had never been a cop. How about if I press the easy button and use a female character? When I started writing the Beau books, he's a Seattle native. I had lived here less than 2 years. How about if I press the easy button and set it someplace I know well, which was southeastern Arizona? So those things all sort of came into place. But I think the reason there are 26 Beaumont books as of September 9th or September 10th is that I haven't just written about him. If I had only been writing about him, I think the creative energy would have run out a long time ago. As it was, as it is, whenever it's time to write a new book, I'm there. It's like, oh, what have you guys been doing while I've been gone? So in Den of Iniquity, Bo, who in his dotage has now become a dog person, and become a dog person, somebody whose primary source of exercise was jumping to conclusions, is now walking his dog. He comes back from his walk, and there's a strange car in his driveway. He and Mel are, he's in his 70s. Mel is a few years younger, but they're living this sedate sort of life. And who should pop out of that car but his 18-year-old grandson, who has run away from home and wants to come live with Grandpa and Grandma for the rest of his senior year. And this is going to be fun.
Yeah.
And writing that part of the story was a joy to me. It's still a murder mystery.
Right.
But yes, seeing these seniors trying to bridge the chasm between their lives and this teenager is just hilarious. At least it for me.
Well, yeah. And I'm wondering, is that based on your own experience? I mean, do you have, not really?
We're not raising any grandkids.
Okay.
Thank goodness. But Kyle, his grandson, does bear an interesting resemblance to my grandson, Colt, who, as it happens, is also 18 and who was on the phone FaceTiming with me to try to get me.
It all comes full circle to Colt.
And I'm just now writing the next Joanna Brady book. And again, we're seeing people that have been in and out of the books before. Some fan wrote to me and said, my favorite character in all your books is Ignacio Ybarra from Skeleton Canyon. That's Joanna Brady number 5. So he said, did he ever become a doctor or not? So I'm writing this book and they're going to need a doctor. And I had put that email in my name file so I'd see it. And I thought, oh, let's go see what happened to Ignacio. So I was able to put
that's great. You can bring him back.
That connection from books. It must be 10 or 12 books ago into the one I'm writing right now. And I'm at 86.1%, but counting.
How long in general does it take you to write a book? Is it the same every time?
No, it is not the same. Blessing of the Lost Girls took 2 months flat, beginning to end. That's the most recent Walker book.
Yeah.
Overkill, the next Joanna Brady book, was a 15-month battle. This Beaumont book is going to come in at about 3 months. So no, it isn't always the same.
And that's because just some are just harder to write than others, or?
Well, in some books, it just flows. In other books, I have finished a chapter and then stopped for the night. In this book, I've been stopping at a certain time, but often when I'm in the middle of a conversation or in the middle of a scene. So the next day I'm able to pick up and move forward. It's been interesting, and it isn't always the same. But if there isn't a place in the book that gives me goosebumps, if there isn't a place in the book that leaves a lump in my throat, then I don't feel like I'm doing my job.
The goosebump lump check. Yeah, it's important.
Amazing. Yes.
Well, one of the things that's so amazing about you, and correct me if I'm wrong, I think I read this about you or heard an interview where you said that you are not an outliner, right? Even though you write mystery novels with elaborate plots and twists and turns, you don't map it out.
No, somebody was interviewing me and they asked me, well, what kind of tricks do you use to maintain tension? And I said, tricks. I don't use tricks. I just tell the story.
Right.
So no, I don't outline. Actually, my first encounter with outlining was in Mrs. Watkins' sixth grade geography class. I hated it then, and nothing that has happened to me in the intervening decades has changed my mind. Aligning. I start at the beginning, usually with a dead body, and spend the rest of the book trying to find out who did it and how come, or I already know who did it, and I'm wondering how he's going to get caught.
So sometimes you don't even know starting who did it.
Sometimes I don't know who did it until close to the end of the book.
Wow.
The second book, I was probably at about 60% when I realized the person I thought was the killer just didn't have the gumption to do that. It had to be somebody else. And somebody else, well, and somebody else asked, well, did you have to go back and change the story? And I said, no, he was innocent the whole time.
Yeah. That's amazing. So you just let the characters and the actions dictate where this is going to go. They sort of speak
Absolutely.
to you.
Yes.
That's fun. That sounds very fun.
Well, it is fun. And writing this book has been very much like getting on a roller coaster ride and going with it. It's in the first, well, I'm talking about the book I'm writing now, not the book that's going on sale, but
Right.
it starts with a character, Joanna Brady's daughter, who was 9 years old on the first page of the first Joanna Brady. And this book starts with Joanna going to Phoenix to speak at Jenny's graduation from the police academy.
Wow.
So I've watched these characters grow and change throughout the decades. And it's really, it's like they're real people to me.
How do you, so you had mentioned earlier in this interview that you've never been a detective, you've never studied, policing. So how do you feel when you write these stories that it's going to ring true, the procedural part of the book? Like, have you interviewed detectives in your life? Do you do reporting on that, or is it just something that comes naturally to you?
It doesn't come naturally. I read a book this summer. Someone wanted me to read it and say what I thought. And I was really incredibly disappointed. I was expecting something that I was going to really enjoy. And they were so loosey-goosey about handling evidence and so blind to forensics that I was really offended. And I figured out how to say something nice, but it wasn't easy. I was trying to be, you remember what Thumper's father said. So, but I watch a lot of what my husband, he prefers home and garden TV. I watch Blood and Guts, and that's because true crime on TV has enabled me to learn a lot about forensic, forensic genealogy, for instance, and I try to be cognizant about requirements for search warrants and so forth. And I didn't know I was writing police procedurals until I had already written 3 when my editor told me. But I really try to pay attention to that. And I'm always really gratified when I hear from retired cops who tell me they really enjoy my books.
Well, that's wonderful. How do you come up, like your book right now, Den of Iniquity, deals with opioid addiction, domestic violence, very kind of timely. Well, domestic violence has always been around, but certainly opioid addiction is a very timely issue. I'm wondering, do you let the sort of headlines inform some of your ideas, or is it people you've met, maybe, or both, maybe?
When all you hear about what the headlines are, the headlines.
Mm-hmm.
Another opioid addiction death. Here, there. What struck me about those headlines is that for every one of them, there's a grieving family. For every one of them, there are years of losses. There are economic impacts of children left parentless because of opioid addiction and domestic violence. And so my character, Yolanda Aguirre, the forensic economist in this book, who's actually named after the Yolanda Aguirre who was in my homeroom at Bisbee High School.
Once again, yeah, harkens back.
But she's doing a study, and that's what she does. She goes to those families of the opioid death families, and as interviews them and gets the background family information, the personal information, and the economic impact. And writing that book makes me see those headlines in a different fashion now, because having created each of those different family dynamic situations, I can see that it happens over and over. And so I think this book will help readers see that those aren't just names. They're not just a statistic in opioid deaths in King County, Washington, but they affect real people. Even though my character's in fiction.
Have you ever thought about writing nonfiction?
No, I haven't. I actually have one volume of nonfiction.
Mm.
It's my book of poetry. It's my autobiography in poetry and prose.
Mm.
And it tells the story of my journey with my first husband, and tells the beginning of the story of my meeting and marrying my second husband. But when I was married to my first husband, I knew he was a drinker when I married him, but I thought I could fix him, and I couldn't. But we were living on the reservation in the late 60s and early 70s. We'd come home from school by 6 o'clock at night. He'd be passed out in his recliner. And we were 30 miles from town, 2 miles off the highway, 30.
Wow. You were really isolated.
7 miles to the nearest telephone. And so on those long, lonely evenings, I sat at the dining room table and scribbled off bits of poetry.
Mm.
And then, because I wasn't supposed to be a writer, I hid them in the strongbox. My husband never saw them. So I wrote the poetry over the course of years. In 1972, when my daughter was born, he dropped me off at the hospital to have the baby. Then he left and went on a 3-day bender, picked me up drunk when he came back to the hospital 3 days later. And I had a choice of holding the baby and having him drive, or him hold the baby and me drive. So I drove home. I drove my home. And I told him, okay, you always said when we had kids, you'd stop drinking. The kid is here. It's time. So he went into the house and poured out his booze, all of it. And we went through 5 days of DTs where we couldn't turn off the lights because the bugs crawled on him. He played chess at the dining room table with people I couldn't see. Mm. And that was, I was strong during those 5 days with him and a newborn baby because he was keeping his promise. But 3 weeks later, he started drinking again. And that was, so when someone is in, that was sort of the beginning of the end. But it took a long time to end. That was in 1972. I didn't divorce him until 1980. when he showed up at my 6-year-old son's t-ball game, so drunk that when the game was over, he crawled on his hands and knees from the bleachers back to the car.
Oh my goodness.
And that was when I realized that if 18 years of loving him hadn't fixed him, I had to save my children and save myself. And so that's when I got a divorce. A year and a half later, I was living in Seattle. He was living in Phoenix in a house that had formerly been owned by his grandmother, but his mother had inherited it. He was living there rent-free. He was working construction. He injured a hand in May, and because it was work-related, he was on workman's comp. So he lived rent-free, utility-free in this house. And for the next 6 months, he drank. November came, and Mary Grandma, my first mother-in-law, called him up just before Thanksgiving and said, I just scored a last-minute ticket to Phoenix. I'm coming down so we can have Thanksgiving dinner together. In honor of her visit, he went off booze cold turkey. They had Thanksgiving dinner. At midnight, a Tempe cop found him lying in the street, assumed he was the victim of a hit and run, but when they got him to the hospital, he had gone into DTs. He was hospitalized with no kidney or liver function.
Oh my goodness.
And he died a month later. And I was at his bedside when he died. Because I got a divorce to save myself. I didn't get a divorce because I stopped loving him. So on New Year's Eve, I took Mary Grandma out to dinner, and then we came back to the hospital. And I had been with her and him in Phoenix for 5 days. And this is what I wrote. We keep a vigil by his midnight bed, his mother and his former wife, grieving for the man we loved and lost. It's harder for his mother than for me. I've already known the sting of loss. She's only now begun to see she cannot win. The hours roll by. A nurse comes in and loosens his restraints, not looking at the women waiting there. She knows. She doesn't want to say. The hours flow by. All stories are expended, yet we need some sound to hold the time at bay. Please sing, his mother asks me, and I do. It is a serenade of love, of songs we knew and treasured through the years, from barroom ditties to sweet hymns. The hours flow by. We hold his hands. I wait to see if he will breathe again. He doesn't. It's over. Amen.
That's beautiful.
When 3 months later, when I had to get out all the documents you have to have for when someone dies, there in the strong box were all those pieces of poetry. And when I looked through them, I was floored because it was like seeing my life in instant replay. Someone said these need to be a book, and they are a book. And the title poem of After the Fire goes like this. I have touched the fire. It burned me, but I knew I lived. It seared me, but it made me whole. He called me. I went gladly, though I saw the rocks fell laughing through the singeing air. I have known the fire. I'll live with nothing rather than with less. The flame is out. There's nothing left but ash. That book is still out in hardback. It's been in print for years now. And at a signing last year, a woman told me, reading After the Fire saved my life. She said, everything that went on in our house was a secret. And after I read After the Fire, I knew I didn't have to keep those secrets anymore.
That's a beautiful thing to hear.
In the hands of people who are living that nightmare, that book is a real ray of hope. So yes, I have written fiction.
Well, for those also just listening to this, you recited those poems. You weren't reading. So these are poems that have just burned their way into your memory?
No, not into my memory, into my heart.
Into your heart. All right. I have one last question to ask you, because what an extraordinary life you've led, and so much adversity in your life. Even in this short conversation, people telling you can't write because you're a woman. You can't write Indians, books about Indians. Your husband, having to cope with what you had to deal with your first husband. We should mention you have a second husband that you've been married to for how many years?
39.
39 years. So you did it. You did good.
I met him at a widowed retreat on the 21st of June of 1985, where I had been invited to do a poetry reading of After the Fire.
Oh, wow.
That retreat, we discovered that our first spouses had died on the same day of the year, 2 years apart. They both died on New Year's Eve. On the 21st of June. We married on the 21st of December. Everybody said, this is too much of a rush. Are you pregnant? No, we weren't. And you know what? It's 39 years later, and the people who said it would, we're still laughing at the people who said it would never work.
Well, what do you credit all this resolve in your life, all this kind of pushing through, and also writing, what is it, over 70 plus books?
And in years, I've written a weekly blog for probably 15 years now.
Wow. What is it?
It's a compulsion to write. Writing is what I always wanted to do. And
it's just where you're happiest.
It is my happy place, except when a book isn't working.
Yeah. Then that's a problem with me, is that so much of it isn't working all the time, that it's not always when it's working, it's a wonderful place to be. I guess it's working a lot more for you than it's not working. Otherwise you wouldn't keep doing it.
I don't know. This is my living room.
You're showing me your living room. Okay.
If there had been a railroad track in Bisbee, Arizona, I would have been born on the wrong side of it. And to live in a place like this is just an incredible miracle to me. And I've done the writing, but it's my readers who have put me in this place. And I'm incredibly grateful to my readers. So when somebody sends me an email, I respond. I don't like to respond to snail mail because I don't have a secretary. Snail mails, you need to get the printer to work, you need to get the paper, you need to find the envelope, you need to find the stamp. So email works, but I try to respond to every single email that is sent to me.
J.A. Jance, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast. The book is called Den of Iniquity. So look for it in your bookstores, on Amazon, wherever you may find books. Again, and have a wonderful day. I'm sorry about the technical difficulties at the beginning of this.
Now I'm going to go out and get my 10,000 steps.
I love that you get 10,000 steps. Is that every day?
Every day. Just a second. Let me check something. At this point, I have 1,011 days consecutive of 10,000 steps a day. I'm at 27,406,314 steps, but who's counting?
But who's counting? Well, that is just incredible. What a great way to end. Keep stepping. Thank you so much, J.A., for joining us. All right. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Right About Now, hosted by my dad, Jonathan Small. If you like what you heard, there are a few ways you can help support the show. First, please leave a rating and review wherever you may listen to this podcast. This really helps others find Right About Now. You can also head over to patreon.com/rightaboutnow